Hello and welcome to this RSM webinar, Global Crisis and Procurement, How to Stay Responsible While Being Effective. My name is Klaas Wassens and this webinar is broadcasted from Erasmus University in Rotterdam, live. You may be a supplier and thinking that your client is renegotiating its contract. You may be a client thinking that you need to renegotiate the contract and ask for lower prices or disagree about the deliveries. In this crisis time, procurement is debated and people are looking for flexibility, lowering cost. And we wonder if this behavior is ethical and realistic to do right now. If you have questions about this topic, you can raise them as well. You need to log in, use the chat room, type in your question, and also put in your name, and we'll seek to answer that question during this webinar. With me is Finn Wijnstra. Hello, Finn.
Hello, Klaas.
You are professor in procurement and supply management at RSM.
Yeah.
And your work brings you in close contact with international companies, Philips, Heineken, Unilever, yeah, and also with regional government organizations. And you also teach your procurement and purchasing professionals.
Yeah.
Now, especially in Holland, there's a debate going on in the healthcare sector and how we could procure enough mondcaps to hospitals. And in retail and in fashion, there's also debate going on how to deal with this consequence of the crisis. Yeah. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think referring to the healthcare in particular, I think there's huge challenges. Okay, so we've not had anything like this before. If you look at just the ICU capacity, we've reached a plateau of 2,400 beds in the Netherlands, while normally the max capacity is 1,200. So this puts a lot of strain not only on human resources, but also on physical resources. So I think we're really facing unprecedented times. And this also creates new ways of working, I think, or demands new ways of working. So the good thing, for instance, in the Netherlands is that there is a national center for now procuring these items such as face masks and respiratory machines, where actually people from, let's say, the profit sector with, for instance, experience in sourcing in China are collaborating with the procurement managers from the different hospitals to get the right amount and quality of these materials in time. So I think there's a lot of new forms of collaboration happening nowadays. Yeah.
Yeah, that's new, of course, I understand. But stock-listed companies are really, really affected. The prices has plummeted tremendously.
Yeah, let me start by acknowledging that above all, we're facing a humanitarian crisis. I think today we have in total something of over 125,000 deaths now, and more than 2 million COVID-infected patients worldwide. But if I turn to the slide and show you a little bit of the dimension of the economic crisis, and I think we're all aware of this, but just to remind ourselves again, here you see the trend of the so-called Purchasing Managers Index over the last 10 years, 20 years. And you see actually that in March already there was an unprecedented drop in this so-called PMI. And the PMI, by the way, is a kind of survey-based index, but it's used by a lot of economists now to predict what could happen with GDP. And this sign, this drop was already a sign that a lot of things were going to happen to GDP. And surely, I'm adding now the World Economic Outlook by the IMF earlier this week. You see that the global outlook is very dark indeed. Where we have now the great lockdown rather than the great crisis. And you see that world economy is declining. The projections, at least for 2020, are projected with 3% decline. And 1 or 2 countries will still have a small growth, but most countries face actually a very strong decline. Just here in the Netherlands also, we had on Friday the 13th of March, just 1 day after the university actually closed, we had the biggest single drop in the Amsterdam exchange stock prices. And the outlook keeps changing as the conditions are still changing as well. So in times like these, even though they're unprecedented, we still have some crises in the past, I think, that we could look back to for lessons, not just for the economy as a whole, but I think also particularly for procurement. So allow me to go back a few centuries. In this slide, I have a short story or anecdote, if you like, about King Gustav Vasa from Sweden. I've worked a lot in Sweden, so hence my interest there. And I think in times of crisis, there are typically 2 main ways you could go about, and either go your own way or work together. And this applies also to procurement and supplier relationship management. Now, Gustav Vasa was the leader of the Swedish War of Liberation against Christian, the king of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden at the time. And Gustav was often labeled as the father of the Swedish nation. At the same time, he was also, he built himself a reputation as a merciless ruler, if you like. And here you see how that worked out in terms of procurement. Now, by the way, as an anecdote, Gustav studied at the same university where I took my first lessons in procurement, Uppsala University in Sweden. But that's where the parallel ends. And this kind of threats to suppliers is probably not the best way.
No,
for instance,
I imagine that he was very harsh in his response.
Yeah. So, and you can discuss about how credible is this threat, because if all blacksmiths say, well, yeah, let's do that, then who will not have any blacksmiths left? But there's you can criticize this approach in a lot of ways, and sometimes you need to be very clear. But I think there's also other ways to deal with a crisis, and I hope to discuss some of those ways.
I would hope that this response is not what we see currently in the market.
No. I think
you see a bit of this.
I see a bit of it, yeah, surely, and some of these have been publicized already. There's also very good examples, and I'll come back to those as well. But I think we should not be blinded by the couple of good examples we'll see, and I'll show you some statistics later that it seems that some of this approach is still more dominant than the more cooperative approach. Okay. So the question indeed is how do buying organizations respond to the crisis, humanitarian and economic crisis that we currently face? So in the next slide, I'm showing you some findings from a survey that colleagues in the US did, the Center for Advanced Purchasing Studies, quite recently, week of 12 March. And they did a survey among 74 CPOs, Chief Procurement Officers, mostly from the US. And not surprisingly, the most common response here was that they would be reducing spending. Primarily discretionary spending, so then you have to think of indirect spend, so materials, services that you need for your own organization, but not necessarily in order to serve your customers. So this would be catering for your employees, which the need for that is going down, travel, etc. Maybe some investment in offices, etc. But also capital investment is being reduced, okay? And within that setting of these overall measures, firms are taking various specific measures, such as shifting to alternative sources or even renegotiating contracts. So I think that might be an interesting point to have a look through a poll what the common actions are among today's webinar audience.
Okay. So this is a moment where we need your input. We have a poll now. You can log in and select the one that you think is most relevant or the one that you prefer. And we take up to 2 minutes for you to submit your preference, and then we're going to discuss what you, during this webinar, suggest a possible response could be. Now, this was America, and it was, could we say, early days, especially in the American situation. So would you expect a different outcome if you would do the same questionnaire right now, do you think?
Yeah, it's a bit difficult, but I think there might be some differences. In the options now, we're not explicitly asking people to respond to whether they're reconsidering offshoring, for instance, in favor of nearshoring or reshoring. But that is, I think, from what I've seen now in the US, a pretty typical response nowadays. I do think, for instance, the option like shifting to alternative sources, I've already heard some anecdotes. Formaldehyde, for instance, used a lot in products for IKEA. IKEA is closing in many countries, so there's a lot of oversupply at the moment for formaldehyde, so there's a lot of shifting going on there. So I think some similarities will be there, but I think particularly the offshoring, which I will come back to later, will be not as pronounced as in Europe, is my expectation. Okay.
We have some preliminary results already. I think assessing subtiers in the supply chain is pretty popular. Shifting to alternative sources, as you already recalled. Increasing inventories is the least, say, preferred.
Interesting.
And indeed, renegotiation contracts is happening as well. So is this more or less the same or than we saw in America, or I see a few differences as well?
I see quite a few differences. I think the option of organizing other means of transport was definitely more popular in the US sample. Now, I don't know about our webinar's audience today, how it splits up, for instance, across service versus manufacturing. So if there's a lot of service people here today, then this is understandable. Okay? The same goes for increasing inventories, why that is not so popular. I think the first, assessing subtiers in the supply chain, is interesting. I'll come back to that more in detail. This is typically something we go back to in times of crisis, when we suddenly realize that we don't just have first-tier suppliers, but that they have suppliers as well. And often the problems are there rather than in the first tier.
But companies should know, of course.
Yeah, they should, and they've been warned multiple times. But I think some of my colleagues, Tom Choi in the US and others, have pointed out that indeed people have short memories, and once the crisis is over, then assessing your food supply chain takes a lot of time and costly. So then the more urgent issues, apparently urgent issues, take over, and people forget about that transparency.
So. So this is the research that we have right now, but how to behave under pressure, it has happened before, don't we? There are lessons to be learned from the past.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think what I see, so yes, there are lessons from the past that we sometimes seem to forget. But above all, I think what is interesting in the current discussions, and I've attended quite some webinars these days, is that the notion of integrity or ethics seldomly comes up in these discussions.
Is it? Is it important in this way, in this moment of time?
I think so. I think so. Yeah, in different ways, as I will try and discuss. But I think first of all, we have our professional codes of conduct. But I think it's also in the interest of buyers to behave ethically. It will preserve their supply base. And it will make sure that suppliers are willing to help out in different times.
You have an example of your personal family history, don't you?
Yeah. So I'll come back to that indeed. I think this. So let's first maybe define what is ethical procurement. It is indeed, in essence, if you like, about treating suppliers fairly and responsibly. And here's a more detailed definition in the slide. And indeed, as a kind of personal anecdote, I want to kind of discuss my maternal grandfather. He was born in the late 19th century. As you can see, he's pictured here on the far right. He was a farmer. And also he operated a water mill, like you are also a miller, I understand.
Yeah.
So, and even in those days, most people were pretty self-reliant, and they grew their own vegetables, they had their own meat. But my grandfather was dependent still on a number of important suppliers, such as carpenters, blacksmiths. And throughout all the crises that he lived through, such as the Spanish flu and World War I and World War II, my grandfather upheld a sort of code of conduct, acknowledging the mutual dependency he had with his suppliers. So, for instance, he was always pretty keen on splitting up his purchases across the two blacksmiths in the town of Haarlem, where he lived, so that he would have two suppliers to choose from in the future, but above all, because he felt that those two families which he would meet in church or in town also deserved a living.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think those values were probably had the product of geographically closely knit communities, church, etc. We now have professional communities that also explicate similar values. Okay, so in the Netherlands, for instance, we have a code of conduct of the Navy. Okay, you see it here. I've used the Dutch version. Apologies to the international guests. And the Navy, the Dutch Purchasing Management Association in the Netherlands, it stipulates fairness on the top left here as one of the four main principles, which includes honesty, reliability, confidentiality, and do no harm. And I feel these values need to feature much more prominently in the current discussion, how procurement can respond and should be responding to the current crisis. We cannot applaud care workers from our balconies in the evening and then go about our regular jobs without explicitly considering these ethical aspects. I think that's a disjunct. And procurement is far too important also for not using those ethical considerations there.
Let's talk about the importance of procurement, I think, in a while, because we have a question. The answer for my company is not among the answers of the poll. I would like to add paralyzing and cutting on capex investments.
Good point.
Is it a good point? Is it lacking in the inquiry or?
No, I think I didn't put it in my list, so I had to make some choices. I used actually the similar questions from the US survey. So indeed, there in the US poll, you saw that quite a lot of companies were cutting on capex spending. Understandably so. I think if you're facing a GDP decline of 3%, yeah, you need less capital assets. At the same time, I think there's a couple of other options that you could think of capex spending. So I'll come back to that later. Yeah. But I think over the years now we've already seen this drive towards servitization.
Yes.
Where we buy not capex, but where we buy services, power by the hour. We buy mobility rather than the engine, and I think that's also a way to contract in a different way and keeping up, let's say, spending.
So if you start renegotiating contract, do it in a change the way you contract with your supplier in a totally different manner.
Yeah, that could be one. If you still feel that investing in the production capabilities would still make sense in terms of market outlook, maybe buying a service rather than capex is a way to go. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for your question. If you have more questions, please use them. Use this opportunity. So log in, use the chat room, type in your question. Ideally, also mention your name or your company name if you feel comfortable with it. And then we'll see whether we can answer that question during this session. Yeah. So let's refer back to the importance of procurement. Because if we want to change procurement, do we have an impact?
Yeah, absolutely. Here on this slide, I've just given some numbers for the Dutch situation, but most of us will realize that any organization, also a university, that typically over half of the total cost are related to third-party spend. And to put things into perspective, here you see the numbers for the Netherlands. If you look at it, just the top 30 firms, which is just a fraction of the total business, together they spend almost €1 million each minute, 24/7. That's a huge impact. Okay. If you look at public authorities, they spend a little bit less, but still a quarter of that. €250,000 every minute, 24/7. So when we look at ways to address the current crisis, procurement can be a hugely effective instrument. Okay? Mm-hmm. There's been discussions in the newspapers now in the Netherlands that local government, national government should be actually forwarding their, starting earlier on their investment projects, for instance. So there's a lot of, I attended the other week a seminar by the Navy, indeed outlining that there is a lot of legal possibilities as well to fast track tender projects, for instance. So I think the government has a huge potential, but so does the profit sector. So having said that, I think it's good to kind of look at what are some of the ways to really grasp that opportunity. And recently, my colleague Jan Franceau in Hamburg described the corona crisis, or at least the supply chain aspects related to that, in terms of 5 phases. And the 4th phase is really about helping vulnerable, small, but also critical suppliers. Okay. And that is, in my view, not only the responsible thing to do, but also the effective way to help prepare for a ramp-up, which will inevitably come at some point. We've seen the IMF projections for 2021, which give a 4 to 6% growth worldwide. So we need also to think of this ramp-up at some point. So having said that, I would like to discuss 4 main ways in which I think we can practice effective and responsible procurement in times of crisis like this.
Okay. Tell us.
Yeah. So in this slide, I've documented 4 courses of action. First of all, risk assessment. Secondly, payment terms. And third, contracting, and fourth, business development. Okay? And in the remainder, I will discuss each of these four alternatives in a couple of minutes and give some illustrations. So let's move to the first risk assessment. Supply chain risk assessment, as we already saw in the first poll, comes back in a lot of recommendations. Okay, HBR, McKinsey, if you follow the webinars, they did articles at the moment. Typically, supply chain risk assessment is one of the key issues there. So my recommendations here are not totally unique, but I think the interesting point is that we seem to be falling back into the same trap quite often as we were into earlier. Okay. So many of these recommendations were actually made already, for instance, after the 2011 Japan tsunami, for instance, where a lot of firms actually discovered that while they thought initially they were okay because they didn't have suppliers in Japan, a couple of weeks later they were hit because the suppliers had suppliers in Japan. So let me take a recent example here. Also related to the health crisis, although it doesn't directly relate to COVID. Consider this a so-called single needle dialysis tool. Okay, my local hospital, where my wife works, has run out of these needles because the supplier cannot deliver because of a component shortage. Okay, and single dialysis needles are important because they can reduce puncture-related complications and they preserve dialysis vascular access. The standard tool is a double needle access. Now the cost of this item is very small compared to the total cost of the procedure. Okay, but if it's not there, the traditional double needle procedure needs to be applied with much more handling by the nurses and much more risk for complications. And typically these items are not part or seldomly part of the kind of extensive risk assessment that we should be doing, okay? Because most sourcing risk assessment focuses on high cost items or high visibility items.
So the risk perspective is very much important.
Yeah, particularly from, let's say, the operations perspective. What if there is a shortage, could we replace it with something else? Yes, double, but it has a big impact on the productivity of hospital staff, which is a big concern at the moment.
So let's talk about the remedies a bit.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of remedies here. First of all, I think we need to improve our capabilities to monetarily assess the performance dimensions of different sourcing options. And total cost of ownership has been around for quite some time, but I think many organizations still have a lack of capabilities and procedures to do that really in full. And in the end of the day, if you don't make the different performance dimensions of sourcing options equivalent in terms of monetary, then a lot of managers will still focus on the monetary dimension of a sourcing decision. Okay? So that's first of all. The second is supply chain mapping. And fortunately, many of our participants were already focusing or working on that. And the good thing is that compared to, say, 10 years ago, the cost of doing this is going down. We have artificial intelligence now. There's a lot of more public data that could help you actually mapping your supply chains. We, in research, also use databases to map supply chains of firms.
So the argument that this is very cumbersome is no longer valid, or not really valid.
Less valid. It's still, for some items, maybe more difficult, but I think there's much more opportunities nowadays. And we really need to take the lesson at heart that we need to understand this second, third tier, fourth tier. Then the third step, risk mitigation. Higher inventories might be necessary for some items that you've always kind of managed on the JIT, just-in-time perspective. Maybe for some other items it's not so necessary. Regional sourcing, so many firms have gone for single sourcing worldwide. maybe for some areas it pays off to have a more regional organized supply base. Supplier A is serving Europe, supplier B is serving Asia, for instance. And I think the third aspect here is developing second or backup sources. Now, so let me explain the concept of backup sources, because that's not so typical. But rather than actually buying from 2 or more suppliers at the same time, you could say, well, I have one single supplier to preserve economies of scale, economies of communication, but I have a backup supplier. And if something happens, I can quickly turn to this backup supplier. Years ago, Ericsson was actually the sourcing organization could provide the business with such a backup supplier at a certain cost, I think 25K or something. So that's an option, and you could even ask your current single source supplier to help you organize such a backup supplier.
This option is not very popular, I hear?
To be honest, there's not a lot of research currently being done in particularly backup sourcing, but from what I hear, it's not a very common concept. Okay. Yeah. And again, not all of these actions apply to all commodities or categories equally, but to some issues, in some categories, one may be more fitting than the other. Yeah.
So this is around risk management in supply chain management.
Yeah. And finally, coming back to the discussion about offshoring, I've attended quite some webinars recently, also with practitioners, mostly US-based, and there I was kind of surprised, and at the same time not so surprised, that there was a lot of focus on reducing offshoring. And I think this is a bit of a US dominated debate, if you like. And I understand part of that, but at the same time, I think radical reshoring is not something we should not swing the pendulum back fully. And even some people invoke the term that we needed a Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project, as I'm sure you will recall, was in the Second World War the project to develop the nuclear bomb. And I think that's the kind of language or parallels I would try to avoid in the current times. Yeah.
We have a question, I think. Let's find out. How do we manage the fraud and efficiency towards alternative supplies that the companies did not have any experience, especially for the supply of personal protective equipment?
Yeah.
How do we manage fraud?
Yeah, I think it depends very much on the specific form of fraud. But this is, I actually heard about this by my good friend and colleague Ton Geurts, who is one of these practitioners helping out is this Landelijk Consortium Hulpmiddelen, the National Center for Protective Equipment, to source these items. And I think it's amazing is too positive a word, but it's really devastating that also in these products that we see so many frauds. So the rats really come out of their holes, if you like. I think we need to take action on that. And indeed, for instance, in the Netherlands already, some of these fraudulent suppliers have been put in jail. What we can do from procurement side is, I think, to really behave consistently in an ethical way also in these times. Okay? I'm not saying that we're the ones to blame, but I do think that, and I'll come back to some statistics later, but I do think also in these times we see that some buying firms are actually violating the law in some ways in terms of ethical procurement. Yeah.
Now let's move to, this was risk, this was about risk. So let's proceed with payment and spend a bit of time on what we can do with payment terms.
Yeah. So talking about payment terms here on the slide, let's start out what I think is not so effective and what we still see as very common. So what we've seen in 2008 and what we're seeing now again, unfortunately, is unilaterally some buying firms are extending their payment terms. And there's a whole logic to it. It's very intuitive. The CFO will immediately recognize or anticipate the effects, etc. So I think it's a very tempting alternative to try and demonstrate that you're reacting to the crisis. Okay, I would be interested to see how common this approach is among our audience today. So I'd like to start the second poll.
Another poll?
Yeah.
There's a poll where you can see different options that you can choose. Take a few minutes and pick the one that you really appreciate most. And then with a short delay, we can discuss your preferences on this. So please join us and put your information to us so we can discuss. What would you expect as a possible outcome, I think? Is there a lot of variety in here to be expected?
I think we will see some variety. I will give some examples later on from one and the same sector, actually, where we've seen diametrically opposed examples. Mm-hmm. One actor actually extending payment terms and other actors actually shorting payment terms. The same thing was visible in a survey by Supply Chain Media, just announced, I think, yesterday, the outcomes. And in there, it was a survey of 140 supply chain directors across all of Europe. There, 1 out of 10 indicated that they have reduced payment terms, which is a good sign, I think. But double that amount had extended their payment terms.
Okay.
So I think there's quite some variety.
A variety on that.
Which I expect.
Well, it's a huge variety, I think. Okay, it changes a bit. So, no, we maintain our standard payment terms, which is the majority, I think, and most preferred one. Yes, we extend to all our suppliers, or extend to a large group, or large suppliers, sorry. Yeah. And we shorten. So we see the same variance, shortening and extending the payment terms.
That's very good, And so 18% have shortened their payment terms, according to this poll, which is a good sign. That's double the amount from the previous survey. So that's
the fact that many of the viewers stay as is in terms of payment?
Yeah, I think that's particularly in Europe. I'll come back to that in a second. But in Europe, the legal restrictions, and particularly also in the Netherlands, are pretty strong already. So assuming that those standard payment terms are within that framework, I think it is okay that they're not being changed.
Okay, let's move on.
Yeah, so coming back to the slide, I think there's a couple of counter arguments to be made against extending payment terms, having suppliers wait for their money longer. Yes, this was actually an argument by, I think, Action, the budget retailer, recently in the news, who said, yeah, but we've grown so much and the suppliers have also benefited from this. Yeah, but now the volume is also going down, so they will also be hit hard by the volumes going down. So I don't think that's a very fair argument. I also think more fundamentally, there's no real economic benefit. It depends a bit on the power situation, obviously, but if the cost of capital for the supplier is higher than it is for the buying firm, there's no supply chain efficiency, okay? So you're basically, if you look at across the chain, the cost of capital goes up if you let the supplier wait for his money longer. I think in the long run, the effect is also that there will be actually fewer suppliers, possibly, and therefore even higher dependence for the buying firm. And finally, as we were into already, is that legal restrictions apply, in particular to the public sector and large enterprises. So let me illustrate that here with the legal payment terms following the European Union directive some years ago, where you can actually see that most organizations have a default payment term of 60 days and even 30 for the public sector, okay? And then you can make exceptions in the contract, but large enterprises can only do so if it's not grossly unfair, okay? So I think that's a pretty restrictive situation. And it seems still that in Europe, I've seen examples of firms that extend their payment terms beyond these legal restrictions. And I have not seen any court cases yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were some in the time to come. In the Netherlands, by the way, it is even more restrictive. So there the standard term is 30 days, and even big firms can never go beyond the 60 days.
Okay.
So against that background, let's maybe review some equitable and fair payment principles. And let me distinguish between three main categories. Actual payment for actual deliveries, services, goods, postponed or cancelled deliveries.
There's a slide on this with some more information.
So here you see the actual deliveries. First category, I think, pay on time. And most people are doing that as suggested by the poll results. Perhaps even faster than before. 1 out of 5 is doing that, particularly indeed for smaller vulnerable suppliers, and comply with the minimum legal requirements. An option could be also to think about supply chain finance, okay, under which regime typically the buyer still pays late or later, but the supplier gets his or her money earlier through some financial intermediary. Now, finally, I think an option could be to really order more and invest in inventory, as we discussed also earlier, to prepare for the possible ramp-up. Second category, postponed deliveries. That's a little bit more tricky, okay? What you could think of is paying in advance, okay? We see quite some sectors, cultural sector, now big debate, Germany and the Netherlands, where basically people get vouchers.
Exactly.
Because the show was cancelled, but still these theaters and venues need cash to pay their personnel, etc. So you're actually paying now in advance if you refrain from asking the money back. You could even think about a more sophisticated method, particularly for high-cost items, is paying for production cost buildup. ASML has been doing that in the past a lot, where they actually, and for CAPEX this is quite common, but you can now also think, okay, I'm postponing deliveries, but the supplier has already started working on this, has bought raw materials for this, so why not pay for the actual, now for the actual cost that he or she has already incurred. And finally, then, cancelled deliveries. I think you could apply possibly the same principle there. Pay for the production cost build-up, particularly when there's no alternative use. Unfortunately, we see already some good examples of this I would say, ethical payment terms or methods. Unilever has indicated that it will pay its smaller suppliers earlier, and even, let's say, a budget-oriented retailer like Aldi has indicated that they will pay their suppliers faster, particularly the smaller ones. So it's not just, let's say, the high-end niche players that have this constructive behavior towards their suppliers.
So payment is how to go about payment is a large topic of your story in this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be done there.
We have another question. Thank you for your question. What would you recommend for effectively dealing with supplier bankruptcy during this crisis? Can client deal with bankruptcy of the supplier?
Yeah, I know of stories that I had a CPO last year or so who had to cancel his guest lecture here at the school because he had to go to a German supplier who was almost going bankrupt. And I think I've heard many more stories from the automotive sector that a lot of the actions of the buyers are really focusing in times of crisis on focusing on trying to prevent suppliers going bankrupt. In some cases, it depends whether some companies there it is unavoidable. Okay, so I don't want to say that you should try and avoid all bankruptcies. But I think in many situations it might be a good reason to try and help and prevent it. Many buyers actually already do. And in some situations it might be worthwhile to try with other buying firms to try and help support the supplier. Okay. And actually I think I'll come back at the end of today's discussion to Hennis and Maurits, because in the textile you can imagine that there's a lot of suppliers nowadays, small scale, that are facing this same kind of...
So this is indeed a very relevant question,
absolutely,
I think.
Absolutely.
I think, so this was about payment terms. I think, Finn, we need to skip another example. Let's discuss about innovations in contracting, which is your third element of this.
Yeah, so having covered these two areas now, let's move to the third one, contracting. And very briefly, the innovations in contracting also sometimes happen in period of crisis. So in 1785 in Britain, they had a big problem with prisons becoming full. And there was a committee that convened to study alternatives for the methods they were then using. You see here a prison hulk. There were lots of those in the River Thames. There were lots of convicts there, and they were becoming crowded. Typhus was spreading, etc. So, and coincidentally, in 1770, Cook had explored the east coast of Australia. So then the committee decided that that was an interesting option. The US was kind of not so accessible to the English anymore. So they thought, let's try and move those convicts to Australia. There we have more space, and we're kind of rid of them. And they outsourced the transportation of these convicts. Now, in the beginning, they paid the ship owner based on the number of convicts that were actually shipped on board in London. Now, you can imagine what happened. When the ships arrived in Australia, some convicts had died, and those that survived were in really bad shape because the captains were saving on food and water, etc. So after a while, British government decided, let's do it differently, and let's pay the ship owner based on the number of convicts that arrive healthy in Australia.
It was an innovation in the...
That was an innovation in contracting. Not rocket science, but still an innovation.
Tell us more about innovation.
A story nicely documented in Rob Duke's famous book, The Fatal Shore. So based on this example, I would like to discuss a few innovations in the area of contracting on this next slide. So I think there's two main directions we can think of. One is more to develop better contracts. And I think there's two elements: that more flexible contracts and let's say contracts that offer more common incentives. So the first set of innovations you could think of is share of need contracts. Okay, I don't tell my suppliers I'm going to buy 100,000 widgets next year, but you tell your suppliers, out of my need for widgets, I will buy 80% of those from you and 20% from supplier B, for instance. Okay, that is a much more flexible arrangement than often we have now with, let's say, absolute amount contracts. Now, the second area is performance-based contracting, which in our team here in Rotterdam we've done quite some work on in the recent years. And I think there's a big potential for these performance-based contracts to be applied more widely. And the essence is that a part of the compensation of the supplier is tied to performance. Okay, and in many situations, this is, as we were into earlier, this applies that a service is bought rather than an asset. And here I've listed four main types. The applicability depends very much on the type of asset or service you're considering, but you can think of pay on availability, and the uptime of a server or an airplane or an engine or a production machine. Pay on use, so when you only actually pay for the access to the asset when you're using it, and the power by the hour contracts that Rolls-Royce has made famous. You could also think of pay on qualitative outcomes, where, for instance, Dutch Railways only, well, part of the compensation that Dutch Railways pays to the cleaning supplier is depending on the quality score that the passengers give to the cleanliness of the train. And finally, I think a very interesting concept or form is pay on revenue. We have a big debate here also on the campus in this very building. We have tenants that pay a fixed rent. Why not make rent based, partly at least, on the turnover they make in their shop? Okay? That's a big discussion in the Netherlands. We don't have a lot of turnover rent, but also in 2008 that discussion come up, and I wouldn't be surprised if we have a lot of negotiations going on now. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more turnover rent clauses coming in. Now, the benefits of this is a reduced capital layout, following up on the earlier question. We get more innovation. You typically see that these kind of contracts lead to more innovation on behalf of the supplier because now they see the benefits of investing in innovations. And the big advantage also is that the purchasing spend, the cost for you as a buying organization, they fluctuate with the revenues.
Let's move to business development. This was about innovation. What about business development? Can you touch upon this as well?
Yeah, so the fourth and final element in what I think is responsible and effective procurement is joint business development. And I think still we need to see more examples, more alternatives here. But this is basically in these times of crisis, if the other three measures do not fully do the job, how could you still help your suppliers further, particularly the ones that are critical to you? And there are some nice examples nowadays where buying firms actually help their suppliers to find new customers. Okay, most companies, as we were discussing in the case of bankruptcies, most customers do not have an interest in their suppliers going bankrupt. Far from that. Okay, so you could help them think about alternative applications of existing products. We see a lot of creativity now in the different supply chains here in the Netherlands, but in many countries. We have now a famous bed producer here in the Netherlands who's making masks nowadays. We see sub-suppliers of respiratory machines that made components now making complete machines. So there's a lot of creativity. And sometimes I think the buying firm can help. So here's an interesting example from Hennes & Mauritz that actually helped their suppliers to deliver protective equipment for the healthcare sector. So there's a lot of idle capacity at the moment. They have a lot of experience with sewing techniques, with the raw materials that are used in these kind of protective skirts or uniforms or masks. So I think this is a very nice example, and I'm sure there's more to be seen in the weeks or months to come. Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered quite a lot, I think. We thought about risk assessment, we talked about payment terms, about innovation, and about business development. Yeah. Now we have time for a brief poll, I think, and to find out what is the most popular, say, strategy to go about. So again, log into the chat room, pick the one that you most find appealing to, and we see what our audience thinks of this. You spend the most of time on payment terms, I think. Is this because it's not so popular, and you want to pay more attention to this?
In my experience, but maybe I'm biased, I think in our training we spend, so far we're not spending so much time on it. I still have an idea that not everyone is fully informed about the legal restrictions, and I see I've seen this multiple times that people it's a quick fix, and I think there's a lot of risks associated or negative sides to it which people do not fully realize. So, but that's the reason. I don't think it's for all firms the most important instrument out of these four. Okay.
And I imagine that it all starts with mapping your supplier chain and see what your vulnerabilities are in the complete chain.
Yeah. So that's why I kept it's the second step. Yeah. And joint business development. Well, then you can think of iterations, but I think that's the kind of there's a chronological sequence in a way.
Yeah. We have some outcomes. Better supply chain risk assessment is in this overview seen as the most popular one.
Yeah.
Payment terms still needs to be needs a bit of attention. I think it's the least. But
at the same time, already 2 out of 3 people were already sticking to the and I'm assuming the legally allowed payment terms. So
okay. And the outcome doesn't change a lot. I think assessment seems to be the most wanted strategy for this.
Yeah, that was a kind of that was to be expected based on the results of the first poll. I'm positively surprised by that. Almost 1 out of 4 respondents says that joint business development is an interesting avenue. I hadn't expected that, so I'm very. That's very encouraging. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is all we have time for. So thank you for watching. If you want to know more about what we do in our webinars, there's more to come. If you want to know more about what RSM does in the area of online learning, both for individuals and for corporate clients, you can find more information on our website, rsm.nl/learnwithus. There you can also find information on the fund that Erasmus Medical Center has started to do research on this disease and beat this crisis. So thank you very much for watching. See you next time.